today's presentation is really to give an overview of a report that was released back in February. That's our second annual report or summary report on the status of clean and renewable energy in the state of Connecticut. Next slide, please. So what Will and I are going to go over, I'm going to first start with a quick history and overview of the actual docket that this report comes out of. I'll give an overview of the purpose of the report and why PURA does the report. And then Will and I will go back and forth on giving an overview on the different programs and topics. I'll end with some interesting in-state generation data that we uncovered that's, while not directly encompassed in the state's clean and renewable energy program, certainly relevant in the context of our broader climate and clean energy goals. And then ultimately ends with information on future reports and what we'd like to do in the proceedings moving forward. Next slide, please. Okay, so this report comes out of one of the 11 equitable modern grid tracks that were created back in 2019. And in fact, we actually initiated this docket in June of 2020. We indicated we would do that in 2019 to be more precise. And then in February of 2022, we issued two things. We issued a decision that outlines at a high level the annual process that we'll go through to evaluate the clean and renewable energy programs in the state of Connecticut, giving some rough guidelines and parameters for how those review proceedings will move forward. And then we also issued the first ever clean and renewable energy report. So for folks that are interested, there's a link here. And then we did the same thing again this year, except for we didn't issue guidance on the annual renewable energy review dockets, but we did update the information that we're requesting from the utilities annually to help us create a better report in future years. Next slide, please. Great. So the purpose of the report is, I'm sure the folks here today know that we are involved in clean energy programs largely because the utilities are the administrators of those programs. So as the regulator of the utilities, we have oversight of their administration of those programs. And then when it comes to deep procurements, we also approve those procurement selections ultimately as well. So we are involved in all of these programs and processes. And so we have all these programs. So we wanted to create a centralized document with all the information that we have to help little level set for not only ourselves, but for policymakers, the legislature, the governor's office, everybody, so that we are working off of the same information and insights into the efficacy of these programs. And just one important note as well, so I kind of can go through these bullets in the exact order, but one really important note is not all of the data that we use for this report, or rather not all the data that we have for these programs are included in the report, but they are accessible through the docket, so docket number 220801. So for folks that want to dig in more on the underlying data and for additional data on these programs, we'd encourage you to go there. Next slide, please. So we're not going to cover all of the individual topics that are included in the report. So we wanted to just, before we get into the topics we will cover, wanted to give you a broad brushstroke of all the things that are included. For example, we won't go over the voluntary renewable options program, but a large number of the topics you see here we will go over. So this is what is included in the report so far. Next slide. Next slide. Great. So let's start with some high-level takeaways. The graph on the right is deployment over time since 2011 of clean energy in Connecticut. And I think, I mean, pretty obvious takeaway over the last 10 plus years is the steady deployment of clean energy in Connecticut. You'll see, obviously, with the, I don't know if that's purple or magenta, the other class 1, 2, and 3 line that was kind of a one-time thing. But all of the other major deployments, so resi and non-resi solar, as well as utility scale solar, you see kind of steady growth over the last decade. And one thing we'll get into later is actually 2021 and 2022 are the most successful years for Connecticut in terms of deployment of residential solar, and more details to come there. One thing that isn't necessarily obvious, or isn't necessarily obvious from this graph that are areas for our improvement, is that internally we have a commitment to what's called the Justice 40 initiative. It's a federal initiative by the Biden administration, but really is a North Star for us in terms of making sure there's equitable participation, not only participation, but distribution of benefits in our clean energy programs. We're a little bit short on making sure that underserved communities get 40% of the benefits. That's Justice 40. So that's one thing that we're going to double down on and look to improve on through the annual review dockets that I mentioned earlier. We have the second thing that we're looking to improve upon is we have no insight into the deployment of our SCEFs, or shared clean energy facilities. As of the end of last year, as far as we know, there were none deployed yet. We have 3 years to deploy. So I believe the end of this year maybe is the or early next year is the deadline for that, for the 3 years. So we're hoping that there were some projects that plan to be in service in early this year. So we're hoping to have more information on really the effectiveness of that program design here shortly. And then one of the purposes of this report, and one thing that we're hoping to understand and have conversations around more and more moving forward, is understanding how these programs all fit into the state's broader climate and policies in RPS. Next slide. With that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Will to go over some specific programs.
Thanks, Josh. So I'm going to run through some of our newer clean energy programs, some of the overview of our progress, and just the general details of them. And I'm going to start with the Residential Renewable Energy Solutions, or RRES program, which replaced our legacy net metering and residential solar investment program, or RSIP program. The RRES program began recently, January 1, 2022, and is slated to run for 6 years. This program is administered by the EDCs, both Eversource and UI. Eligible projects include wind, solar, and fuel cell projects with a capacity cap of 25 kilowatts. And projects that partake in the RRES program are under a 20-year term, and they can choose either a netting or buy-all tariff for that 20-year term. Of note, recently, just this year, through Public Act 2148, we enabled multifamily affordable housing to be eligible for this program, which we think is an important step, because otherwise these multifamily homes would have had to compete in other programs against commercial and industrial projects. So we think it's beneficial for them to be able to participate in our residential programs. And additionally, in this program, as Josh alluded to with the Justice 40, we have a target of 40% deployment in low income and economically distressed municipalities. And we try to achieve this through incentive adders and other measures. As far as the goals for the Residential Renewable Energy Program, they're really to maintain Connecticut's annual historical deployment, and while achieving a 100% zero carbon grid by 2040, aligning with state goals. And while doing this, we're careful to balance participant costs and benefits, as well as non-participant costs and benefits throughout the program. And we also try to ensure that program accessibility for all customers and encourage inclusivity with that participation focus in low and moderate income and environmental justice communities. So looking at some of our progress to date, the plot on the left here shows our total deployment in megawatts by town in Connecticut, where the darker the color green coincides with more deployment. The black dots are our distressed municipalities, and those orange horizontal stripes are the environmental justice block groups. You can see to date that we've done a relatively good job of deploying in those distressed municipalities and environmental justice block groups, as they tend to be shaded a little bit darker, but we still aren't at that 40% goal. So that's something we're working to achieve. And we have our annual review docket process, and we're always looking to improve our programs in all aspects, including equity. As Josh alluded to on the right, the most recent 2 years have been our most successful in terms of the amount of residential solar deployed. If you see in the table on the right, 2021 and 2022 were both about 85 megawatts. Notably, the 2022 data here for this report was pulled so it was only through November. So that number is actually probably a little bit higher in reality. The next program I'm going to talk about is our non-residential renewable energy solutions program. And this program replaced the LREC-ZREC program, and with some caveats, the legacy virtual net metering program as well. This program similarly began in early 2022, February 1st this time, and is also slated to run for 6 years. Again, this program is administered by the EDCs, Eversource and UI. And in the first year of the program in 2022, we had only one solicitation, but going forward in programmatic years, we're going to have 2 solicitations each year. As far as additional details about this program, the project size capacity limit is 5 megawatts, which was recently increased from 2 megawatts. And the annual statutory cap for deployment, or projects approved, I guess, is 110 megawatts, which is also recently bumped up from 60 megawatts, which was 50 megawatts for zero emissions and 10 megawatts for low emissions. Similar to RRES program, or projects that participate in this program are subject to a 20-year term and can select between a netting and buy-all tariff. In this program, we have 4 project size categories. So those are small, medium, and large zero emissions projects, as well as low emissions projects. And 3 of 4 of those size categories are subject to competition. The only one that's not is the small zero emissions category, and that's a first come, first serve solicitation. And also in this program of note, recently, we started allowing for oversizing on rooftops to take advantage of that usable space. Else, projects are limited to being sized to on-site loads. So something like a ground mount system needs to be sized to load. As far as the goals for the non-residential renewable energy program, they're really just to foster the sustained orderly development of the state's Class 1 renewable energy industry, which, as you saw in our major takeaway slide, we've been doing quite well since the 2010s, as well as deploying that full megawatt capacity allowable under statute, while making sure we achieve least cost outcomes through our annual solicitations for the ratepayers. And then again, we're trying to enable program accessibility for all customers and increase our inclusivity in this program by achieving, a 40% deployment in those low income and environmental justice communities. So looking at some of the progress to date, these 2 plots on the left are actually from our predecessor programs, LREC-ZREC and VNM. And we see steady deployment with potentially a little bit of a tick down in 2022, which is explainable for a few reasons. 1 would be the pandemic. 2 is that the data for these 2 plots, again, wasn't through all of 2022. I believe the cutoff for this data was October, November 2022. And also our new program, the NRES program, came online in 2022. So looking at projects with executed agreements for the NRES program, we see that in the table on the right. We were able to achieve close to the statutory cap this year with almost 54 out of the 60 available megawatts selected. Much of the capacity we weren't able to use, you'll notice, was in UI territory for the low emission and large zero emissions categories. So the authority position is that we think statewide solicitations may help to achieve reaching the statutory cap, because in that way we aren't limited to selecting a certain amount of projects within a certain amount of territory, but we can look at all projects available statewide, which may lead to better economic outcomes for ratepayers as well. Of particular note would be the low emissions category in UI. Right now, they're only allotted 2 megawatts just because of the 80-20 split, and there's only 10 megawatts total in that category. Whereas the statutory cap for projects is 5 megawatts. So if we're able to open up our solicitations statewide, it's possible that a 3, 4, 5 megawatt project in UI territory would be able to be selected under this program. So now I'm going to look a little bit more at some of our solar deployment to date from a regional perspective. And so this plot in the top left shows solar deployment per capita installed by state. Again, darker shades of green indicate more deployment per capita in this case. And you'll see almost all of the states that are in the highest tier are in the Southwest United States. The few exceptions in the Northeast are Vermont, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. And respectively, those 3 states have ranked 1, 2, and 3 in historical deployment per capita in the region in the Northeast, which you can see in the table on the bottom right. However, 2 of those states, Massachusetts and Vermont, are projected to have much slower growth going forward and are actually ranked 7th and 8th in the Northeast region for our 5-year projected solar growth. On the contrary, Connecticut has been pretty remarkably consistent to date. We are ranked 6th in the region in deployment to date. And we are also projected in the future to grow at the rate of 6th in the region. And overall, nationally, our deployment levels are quite good as we're in that second tier of deployment, the second darkest shade of green. Oh, and one last thing before we move on from this slide is that the data for the projected growth is from SEIA. And so it may not perfectly encapsulate all of the recently increased statutory caps in some of our clean energy programs. And so that projected growth might actually be a little bit higher in reality than is noted here. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Josh for the shared clean energy facilities.
And thanks, Will. So for the SCEF program, there's really 3 objectives to annually and cost effectively procure 50 megawatts of SCEF, which is the statutory cap, to lower or eliminate unnecessary barriers to entry for subscriber organizations, developers, and then to target savings in specific communities. Really one of the unique functions and features of this SCEF program, which is a community solar program compared to some other community solar programs, is this low to moderate income focus of the program. Next slide. So as I teed up earlier, we don't have any deployment data to go over so far, but we do have selection data to go over. But before I get there, I should really start with there was a predecessor program, or really pilot program, to the current SCEF program, which is really a one-time solicitation run by DEEP, where they selected 3 SCEFs. Unfortunately, and that was we approved those projects. PURA approved those projects back in 2017, the end of 2017. And unfortunately, only one of those 3 projects have come online. So not a lot of data there. There's also a different program structure. So not a lot of takeaways to then inform this new SCEF program, which is really a 6-year program. It's an annual solicitation, very much like the former LRES program and current RRES program that we'll just went over. And just one important note is that the first 3 years of the program, so the program, the first solicitation was in 2020, I believe. The megawatts, statutory megawatt cap was actually 25 megawatts, and legislation last year increased it to 50. So the 6-year total megawatt statutory cap is 225 megawatts. So you'll see on the right, we have summaries of what's been selected to date. Unlike the other programs, for some reason, the EDCs present aggregated data for solicitations, which for the SCEF program. And so what you see here is in total, about 72-ish megawatts have been selected over the first 3 years of the program. And again, though, unfortunately, we still don't have, at least as of the end of last year, didn't have any insights into what's actually been deployed, but again, and which is understandable, right? Given the program started, the first solicitation actually went out right before the pandemic really hit Connecticut, and then the selections were made after that. And then there's been inflation since then. So certainly understandable that it's taken a little bit of time for deployment to come online, but as I said at the top, hoping to learn more this year. Next slide. Great, I'm going to turn it back to Will to talk about the storage program.
Thanks, Josh. So the next program on the docket is the Energy Storage Solutions Program. This is a new program. It doesn't have a predecessor program, and it's for battery storage, and began February 1st, 2022, and is slated to run for 9 years. This program is administered by the Green Bank, as well as the EDCs in partnership. And some key details for this program: it was enabled by Public Act 2153 with the goal of deploying 580 megawatts. And there's 2 main components to this program as far as incentives are concerned. There's the active dispatch component, which is a performance-based incentive, and a passive dispatch component, which is an upfront incentive. In year 1 of the program, projects were required to participate in both active and passive dispatch, but we recently updated the program so projects can elect to participate only in active dispatch as well and forego the passive dispatch incentive. Additional details: there's a residential incentive cap of $7,500, and the CI cap is 50% of project costs. And there's also a sizing cap for commercial and industrial of 2 megawatts or 150% of load, whichever is higher. And we also have a link here to the program data platform, which is hosted by Connecticut Green Bank and shows the most recent program data. There are 7 objectives or goals for the Energy Storage Solutions Program, so I won't run through them all, but I will say that this program, some of the goals do include ensuring cost effectiveness for all ratepayers while fostering the sustained development of the storage industry. There's also a focus in this program on providing storage solutions to vulnerable communities. Again, we have a 40% deployment target. As well as improving customer resilience to grid outages, which is a focus of this program as well. So here, similar to the previous program plots, we have a visualization showing deployment to date of the total approved residential battery storage capacity by town. The map isn't quite as filled out. This program is much newer. We're also, as you can see, when you look at the distressed municipalities and environmental justice plot groups, a little bit behind some of our other solar programs in deploying in those underserved communities, which is something we're working on actively in our annual docket review process. But just more broadly, the residential solar or residential battery storage deployment across the state is a little bit slow out of the gates. As of when data was pulled for this report, there was a total of only 953 kilowatts of submitted or approved projects, which is just under 2% of the 2024 goal. In contrast, the commercial and industrial segment of the program, it has been extremely popular. And when data was pulled for this report, we already had 125.47% of the capacity submitted or approved relative to our 2024 goal. I will note that we expect residential deployment of battery systems to see an uptick in this year and the coming years. One, just due to awareness of the program. It's a new program, so as residents of Connecticut become more aware, we expect higher participation levels. And we also expect that programmatic change where we're allowing active dispatch only programs to active dispatch only projects to participate to help push up our participation a little bit as well. And I will note, I went on the Connecticut Green Bank data platform this morning, and there is over 1.4 megawatts of residential projects. So perhaps starting to see a little bit of a slow uptick in residential deployment. And I will turn it back over to Josh to run through the EV charging program.
Great. All right. So there's really four objectives of the EV charging program, as you can see here. The first, for folks that aren't familiar, Connecticut a number of years ago signed an MOU that essentially committed us to deploying somewhere in the ballpark of 125 to 150 EVs in Connecticut by 2025. So one of the goals of this program is to help us fulfill that MOU. It's also to help us seamlessly integrate EVs into the electric system, into the grid, and kind of paired with that as well, to make sure that this program is helping us meet our equitable modern grid goals, and now really to make sure that we're achieving not only the equitable modern grid goals, but those the goals that we've outlined on Wednesday through our decision in the PBR docket, which of course includes, as we've talked about, the equitable modern grid goals. But really this program is to look to and design elements around helping to maximize the achievement of those goals and outcomes. And then like you've probably heard with all of picked up on, and you've heard in all of the goals so far, the last goal is an equity component, right? To make sure that we're achieving deployment and the benefits of these programs, and this program in particular, equitably. Next slide. Great. So at the very top, in the next two slides, admittedly, there's a lot going on. So I'm going to kind of segment it for you. So at the top right, the top one that you'll see there, you'll see our kind of deployment goals and targets by 3-year cycles. So the way we design both the EV and storage programs is so that they have 3-year cycles, and then we'll do major program reviews after those 3-year cycles. We do the annual reviews to make small tweaks. But then the 3-year cycle is really to critically assess, where our goals correct? Are we achieving those? And do we need to make major changes? So you can see on the top right there is that our deployment goals. And the way we derive those, there's a little bit of an art to this, but at a very high level, we took, there's some modeling that has been done that we relied on that looks at what are the number of chargers that are going to be necessary to meet our state goals. And then we designed the program and these targets around essentially helping to deploy half of what is necessary to meet our goals, very, very roughly. The idea being that the states and these programs don't need to be deploying all of these things. Certainly there is and will be an increasing role for the private market to help deploy this infrastructure. So anyway, so that was kind of the thinking and how we came to those goals. At the very bottom, you can see and at the top is residential. The very bottom is commercial and industrial goals. And what you can see on the bottom left here, sorry if we're going all over the place here a little bit, and what I'll get into on the next slide is we've actually already met or exceeded our goals for commercial port participation in year one for the entire cycle. So I'll say that again. So you can see here for DCFCs, for example, in the bottom right table, our total cycle goal was 137 DCFC ports deployed for that first 3-year cycle. So we've already in year one of the 3-year cycle met that goal. Next slide. Great. The other thing that I want to, so here is all of the data on what we've seen to date. And one of the things that I want to, actually, if you can go back real quick, Will, I wanted to highlight, if you go to the residential single family deployment target is, for the first cycle is 15,000. So we go to the next slide. You'll see that in 2022, well, as of November 30th of 2022, we received roughly 1,500 applications for residential applications for different charters under this program. And so obviously, if you just divide 1,500 by 3, that's not quite to the target. So we have this interesting mix of in certain areas we're exceeding our targets under the EV charging program, and in other areas that we have work to go. That's kind of where we're at a high level. I know I didn't get into the details of the program itself. There's elements of an upfront incentive as well as managed charging components. There's great resources online if you're interested in learning more about the actual design. I did want to, when we first gave this overview of the program, Will and I did not have the benefit of having Stephanie or Jenna, who are the real experts on this program, at our disposal. So I just wanted to give some space to Jenna, who's with us today, to see if I to correct anything I might have gotten wrong or to add anything that is important to flag.
No, thank you. I think that was a great overview. I will say that similar to some of our other clean energy programs, that we've had a lot of success in certain areas of the program and then not as much success in other areas. So specifically for the fast chargers and then I believe the multi-unit dwellings, which are essentially apartment buildings, those have been very successful, but then the workplace and light duty fleet charging program area and also the residential program area haven't been as successful. So it's an interesting play between I guess education and marketing and how much people are aware of these programs, and then also the incentive levels that we've established for the different program areas, and how much has it been that maybe it's just the amount of incentive for the fast charger program area that is really encouraging the amount of uptake that it has. So that is definitely something we'll be looking at in this year's program review, and yeah, also essentially trying to expand it, trying to get more areas of electric vehicles participating in managed charging programs and building out chargers and things like that. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Jenny. Yeah, no, and that's great insight into the things that we weigh in these annual review dockets and what we'll be focused on this upcoming year. We can go ahead and go to the next slide, Will. Thanks again, Jenna. So as I mentioned at the outset, we also are involved in the deep procurements of utility scale renewable energy projects as the kind of final approval of those. So since 2011, DEEP has run 10 procurements that have resulted in 1.6 gigawatts or 1,600 megawatts of deployment. And you can see the graph right of the kind of the time sequence of when that has been deployed. That's just what they've done to date. The next bullet really highlights the fact that DEEP has a lot of procurement authority, like a lot. And if anyone's really interested in digging into what their procurement authority is, I'd encourage you to look at their most recent integrated resource plan, or to look at the RFP that they just released, or I think this may be more accurately an intent to release an RFP that walks through some of the existing procurement authority. But they have essentially the equivalent of 95% of our state's annual load. So our annual load is about 25 gigawatt hours, or there's 25 million megawatt hours. Maybe that's I think that's the right units per year. So the 25, or rather 95% of that amount they are authorized to procure up to, and they've done some of that already, but that's the total scale of what they can procure. And then I already mentioned the 2020 IRP, but they did some analysis recently, and they showed that some of what they've selected through these procurements so far haven't come online for various for a myriad of factors or reasons, and many of them I covered it when I was talking about the SCEF program. And so they've identified about 170 megawatts worth of retirements or projects that weren't built that they're likely going to try and replace here with a new RFP. Next slide. Right, so that's a summary of all the programs, program data, some of the considerations that guide us, and some of the things we'll be thinking about here in the future, as well as the deep procurements. This is the promise in-state generation data that I wanted to go over that Will and I just kind of find fascinating, and as I mentioned earlier, is important to understand when we're trying to achieve what I said we really feel like we need to work on, is understanding better how everything that Will and I just walked through fits into our state goals for clean energy deployment and addressing climate change. So as you can see here, very simply stated, and as I'm sure you picked up from the earlier slides, the state's increased its zero carbon generation over time. And there's kind of two different accounting methodologies for GHG, or greenhouse gas emissions. There's consumption and generation based. So based on what we're consuming and what's put out there on the grid and what we've contributed to the grid, our emissions, electric sector, power sector emissions are going down. If you just do generation, which is what's the generation in the borders of Connecticut, it's actually gone slightly up because we're upstream on the gas pipeline. So Connecticut is a good place to put gas generators. And so there's been fossil fuel generating power plants that have been deployed in Connecticut. Next slide. And so really what we want to highlight on this this slide. So I think we all know as a region we're relying on natural gas. I just mentioned that we still new gas plants they're having a hard time getting permitted, but at least in the last half decade have been deployed. What's really interesting here, and you can see the primary sources on the left of what's been generated in Connecticut. So again, mostly natural gas with a lot of nuclear. That of course is the Millstone power plant. But I actually think that the one on the left was probably most of us could guess if we're thinking about what's in-state generation. The one on the right, I was actually frankly not aware of, is that we actually generate more electricity in Connecticut than we use, and the divide is increasing. So that's a really interesting result as we think about our role in the region. Next slide. We also generate, and this feeds out comes from the last conclusion that we generate more than we use. We also generate a lot more than other states. So you'll see on the left, we're about, as we already mentioned, about 50-50 zero carbon, which is mostly nuclear and carbon. And then the next biggest generator of in-state generation is Massachusetts, who isn't even half of what Connecticut generates. And for context as well, regional context, Connecticut is about a quarter of the overall region's load, and Massachusetts is about half. Next slide. Great. So that again is just insights into that's. We talked about deployment and lots of good programs that are helping to deploy more and more clean energy. But as you can see there, there's still lots of fossil generation on the system. And so it just also contextualizes scale of magnitude of what's been done with the clean energy programs and what still exists out there. So great. So to end on other resources and what we're looking to do with this report in the future, there's great employment clean energy program and just in-state clean energy data that I believe it's the Green Bank Joint Committee with the Energy Efficiency Board that they did a report at the end of, not last year, but I believe it was end of 2021, where they had a report that put out, the number of green jobs essentially in Connecticut. So that's an interesting resource to look to. And then I've already mentioned some of these, at least the deep integrated resource plan, but there's also an electric vehicle charging location tool, which is relevant to the targets that we set that I mentioned earlier. And then this Green Bank, you'll see the third bullet is the report I already talked about that's related to employment data. And then within the docket, as I mentioned at the top, there's more, so 220801, there's more data on each program. And then for future reports, we're actually in the process of retaining a consultant to help us with more, to add a cost benefit analysis for each one of the programs that Will and I walk through. So we really have and policymakers have an apple to apples comparison on the cost and benefits of the program. Which will include not just electric sector benefits, but include all of the benefits and costs of those programs. And then we'll also look at more precisely calculating and defining the emissions reductions attributable to the programs that we've walked to today. And then one thing, we recognize that a static report, while helpful, and certainly the fact that it didn't previously exist is helpful, but really working towards data platforms for the immense amount of data for all of these programs is really what we'd like to see in the future. So we're working on that in various fronts and hope to have at least with the clean energy programs, a comprehensive platform online at the EDCs will have one online beginning next year.